Okay, so now we're moving on to John 1, verse 2. The same was in the beginning with God, according to the KJV, or he was with God in the beginning, according to a lot of modern translations. So, and some translations also say it was in the beginning with God, or the REV says, excuse me, this word was in the beginning with God. So the main thing that we've covered beginning, we've covered God. I just want to look at, and we've covered logos, but we're going to look at something that's important in terms of translating this whole prologue, which is how do we use the pronouns assigned here? Is it a he, or is it an it? Is it like the King James uses it? Is it the same? How personal should these pronouns actually be? So we're going to start off looking at the masculine pronoun and logos, why it is a legitimate translation, along with he as a legitimate translation. It could go either way. But the translators have a choice, and I believe the choice should be in harmony with how logos is translated throughout, not only John's Gospel, but throughout the entire New Testament. So the core issue is grammatical gender versus personal pronouns. Or let me rephrase that, grammatical gender versus personal identity. So one of the most significant interpretive questions in John's prologue concerns the masculine pronouns used to refer to the logos meaning a word in this case. But that's how it's commonly translated in English. And now I will say this, that's our limitation. We are English speakers. There may be people that are from other countries listening to this whose native or mother tongue is not English, and they've probably got a better idea of what's going on here than English speakers who've really never learnt another language where all nouns are assigned a gender. So many English translations render these pronouns as he and him, which naturally leads readers to assume the logos is a personal being distinct from God as in some way, or a personal being as part of a Godhead. But this rendering reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how grammatical gender functions in Greek, and not just in Greek, like many languages, including German, French, Spanish, which I speak, and Hebrew, assigns grammatical gender to all nouns, not necessarily based on biological sex, although that can be the case, and not necessarily assigning them a male or female based on personal identity, but based on linguistic convention. Now, I'm going to get into this as an example using Spanish a bit later on, and please stay with me because that will really open it up for you. But in Greek's got three genders. It's got masculine, feminine, and neuter. And crucially, pronouns in Greek must agree with the grammatical gender of the noun that they are used to replace, regardless of whether the noun refers to a person, a thing, or some abstract concept. As Daniel B. Wallace explains in his widely used grammatical textbook, quote, Greek, like other languages, has grammatical gender. This does not necessarily correspond to natural gender. A Greek pronoun agrees with its antecedent, I mean, just the word that's come before it, in gender and number, but not necessarily in case. So that's it, that's end quote, well, that's from Greek grammar beyond the basics. And so this means that when a masculine pronoun appears in Greek, it doesn't automatically indicate a male person. It simply indicates that the pronoun is grammatically agreeing with the masculine noun that came before it. That's it. And it's the same in Spanish, French, German, Hebrew. And when I say those languages, they're modern languages, right? Hebrew as a modern language, and Hebrew as an ancient language as well. Now, logos is a masculine noun. So the word that's translated word, the Greek is logos, and that is actually in Greek is a masculine noun. Therefore, any pronoun referring back to logos must also be masculine. It's a requirement of Greek grammar. It's not a theological statement about the logos being a he or a person. If you look, say, I'll give you an example in German, which I speak very little of. Ich verstehe nur ein bisschen Deutsch. But the word for, say, table in German is Tisch, der Tisch. And it's masculine. And if a German speaker uses a pronoun to refer to a table, they would use the masculine pronoun or he in English. So no one would conclude, though, from this that the Germans believe tables are male persons. And the same principle applies to Greek, Spanish, French, and a few other languages. So, for example, if we go back to the word logos in Greek, it's used in John 6, verse 60, and this gives us an idea. It says, many, therefore, of his disciples, having heard, said, this word is hard. Who is able to hear it? So when now some translations have this teaching or this saying, this message, but this word is hard. Who is able to hear it? So in this case, logos is then... The pronoun used for logos in this case, at the end of the sentence, the translators choose to use the word it in English. Now, it's the same pronoun, the masculine genitive pronoun, auto, that's used in John's prologue as well. But it's obvious here that what's happening in this verse, they're talking about a teaching that the disciples heard. This is to do with... basically eating the flesh of the Son of Man. They heard it and they think, oh, this is way out. Well, you know, we can't make head or tail of this. This saying it. So that's just the precedent I want to put forward. So logos, pronouns referring back to logos can be translated as it, and a case in point here in John 6:60. So no English translation renders this as who can hear him, because the context makes clear that the disciples are talking about Jesus' teaching or saying, not a personal being called the Word. But it's the same word used in John prologue, logos. And so every major translation correctly renders the masculine pronoun there, which is auto, as it. You can look at the ESV, NIV, NASB, KJV, NRSV, because the referent is clearly an impersonal concept, which is the logos in this case is a teaching or a saying, not a person. So what are the logical implications here for the early part of the prologue of John, specifically John 1:1-3? So if translators consistently render masculine pronouns referring to logos as it when the context is clearly impersonal, as in John 6 verse 60, then the decision to render them as he in John 1:1-3 is an interpretive choice of the translators. It's not a grammatical necessity. That's the point I want to get across here. And going back to my first point in the first video in this series is that logos throughout the rest of the Gospel of John, logos is used around about 40 times, and it never ever refers outside of the prologue. Just keep that in mind. But outside the prologue, it's never used of a person. So you could then translate John 1:3, for instance, which we'll get onto in a bit more depth later on in the next video, but all things came into being through it, and apart from it, nothing came into being that has come into being. Now, that would work if you're looking at the logos as the word of God, and if you look at Genesis, everything came into being through the word of God. So the pronoun auto here is identical in form to the one used in John 60. But most modern translations translate that verse as all things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. But it can go either way, grammatically correct either way. And the only reason translators render it him in John 1:3, for instance, and it in John 6:60 is theological interpretation, not grammatical requirement. Okay. No, I'm not telling them which way to go, but that's the fact of the matter, that there's no rule saying it's got to be he here and it there. So just a couple of additional examples from the New Testament. If you look at Matthew 13:19-23 with the parable of the sower, in this passage, Jesus explains the parable of the sower. This is his explanation given to his disciples. The word logos is scattered like seed, and the one hearing the word in this particular part of the passage, the logos is treated as a message or teaching, not a person. And no translator renders the references to the logos with personal pronouns. In Mark 4:14-20, which is the parallel account, the sower sows the word. Again, logos refers to a message, and it's not perceived as a divine being. It's the word of God, right? Exactly the same word that's used in the prologue of John. I just wanted to put that in because it's not just John's gospel that uses logos, it's all over the New Testament. 1 John 1:1, the word of life. It says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen concerning the word of life. Now, what we have seen from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen concerning the word of life, the same logos. John doesn't say here who was from the beginning, who we have heard and who we have seen. He's using what. So significantly, John begins with a neuter relative pronoun, what, not masculine ones, even though he eventually refers to the word of life. So this suggests that John himself did not rigidly treat logos as a personal masculine entity. And is there any scholarly support for this? Well, yes. James Dunn, in his influential work, which I quote from quite often, Christology in the Making, Dunn argues here that the logos in John's prologue should be understood against the backdrop of Jewish wisdom tradition, where personification of divine attributes like wisdom and word was common, without implying a literal second divine person. And he quotes on page 243, the logos of the prologue is not a divine being or hypostasis distinct from God. It is God's own self-expression, the means by which God creates and reveals. End quote. C.K. Barrett, in his work, The Gospel According to St. John, he notes, I quote, the opening words of the Gospel recall the opening of Genesis. The word is God's creative and revelatory activity, not a second God, close quote. Murray Harris, in Jesus as God, in his work, The New Testament Use of Theos in Reference to Jesus, he acknowledges, I quote, the anarthrous theos without the article, in John 1:1c is qualitative, emphasising the nature or character of the word, not identifying the word with the person of the Father, close quote. So while Harris himself holds a Trinitarian view, it's his acknowledgement that the grammar emphasises quality rather than personal identity, and I think that's quite significant. Now, I know I've gone over that before in a prior video, but just wanted to bring that up again for your consideration. So if we look at the Jewish background, if we go back to the 1st century, there's quite a lot in their literature where we have personification without a literal personality, without a literal person. So 1st century Jewish readers would have been familiar with the personification of divine attributes in their own scriptures. Now, one of those divine attributes being wisdom. So if we go to Proverbs 8, and I'm only going to quote a little bit of that, but if you go to Proverbs 8 and read the whole chapter, you'll see there's a lot of personification of wisdom. So it says in Proverbs 8:22, Yahweh possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. So wisdom here is like talking about himself. And wisdom is personified, wisdom's personified as a feminine figure, the chokmah in Hebrew and Sophia in Greek, speaking in the first person, present at creation. But no Jewish reader understood this as a literal second divine being. It was a poetic and theological way of speaking about God's attribute of wisdom. Again, the word of the Lord is personified. If we look at Psalm 33:6, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. So it was God that did it, but it's attributing creation to his word. Psalm 107 verse 20, he sent out his word and healed them. So the word isn't literally a doctor or a faith healer, but it went out and did what God wanted it to do. Isaiah 55:11, one of the classics, is quite a lot of personification there, but it says, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty. So in none of these cases is the word understood as a separate divine person. It's God's own expressed will and power. And that's how, I believe, first century Jewish readers of the Gospel of John's prologue would have understood this whole principle. So, okay, we've looked at how I think first century readers would have understood it. So then we have the problem of us reading it now, and a fallacy of reading later theology into this first century text. So if we assume that masculine pronouns in John 1 require he rather than it, I think this commits the logical fallacy of anachronistic interpretation. In other words, reading later theological developments into the text, specifically, I would say, post-Nicene theology. Now, the doctrine of the Trinity, it's difficult to say exactly when that was solidified. It kind of got started, I suppose, to some extent at Nicaea in 325, more specifically in Constantinople in 381. But those creeds, those ideas were not available to John or his original readers in the first century. So if you're going to interpret John's prologue through the lens of these councils, I think that violates a basic grammatical, historical principle. So I think the masculine pronouns referring to logos in John 1 can be and arguably should be translated as the same or it rather than he for the following reasons, okay? Number one, grammatical gender in Greek does not indicate personal identity. We've dealt with that. But masculine nouns require masculine pronouns, regardless of whether the referent they're talking about is personal. Number two, translators already follow this principle elsewhere. We looked at John 6:60, where masculine pronoun is referring to logos and consistently translated to it. The Jewish background supports, point three, the Jewish background supports personification without personality or being a real, literal person. First century Jews personified wisdom, word, and other divine attributes without understanding them as separate divine persons. And fourthly, rendering logos as he, again, it's an interpretive choice shaped by later, I believe, shaped by Trinitarian theology, 400 years after the apostles died. It's not a grammatical necessity. So you could quite legitimately, as some Bibles do, translate John 1:1-3 as follows. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was divine. This was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through it, and apart from it, nothing came into being that has come into being. And I think that rendering is grammatically sound. I think it's contextually appropriate, and I think it's consistent with first century Jewish monotheism. But I want to just bring up an illustration here, just to bring this home a bit, with a Spanish analogy, because I speak Spanish. And I want to talk about the problem with assuming gender equals personhood. So just to understand why Greek masculine pronouns don't necessarily mean he in the personal sense, Spanish gives us a really excellent illustration. Now, like Greek, Spanish assigns grammatical gender to all nouns. But this gender has nothing to do with whether the object is actually male or female, or even person at all, even except if it's something really male or female, like a man or a woman. So, for instance, in Spanish, the man is el hombre and the woman is la mujer. So you've got a male form of the in Spanish, which is el, which would be applied to a man. And you've got a female form of the in Spanish, which is la, which would be applied to a woman. Same thing would be a bull and a cow. El toro, the bull, and la vaca, the cow. But you've got a lot of things in. So that's an exception to that rule. If it's really male, then you 99% of the time you're going to use the male the, or the male for a, which would be un. And if it's female, like a cow, so if I wanted to say a cow, it'll be una vaca, not un vaca. So it's just a rule of grammar. But as in Greek, there's things that are neither really male or female. So el carro is the car, el carro. The sun in Spanish is el sol. And love in Spanish is el amor. Now, the cars, the sun and love are neither male nor female, but they're just assigned these either male or female definite articles in this case, or indefinite articles. If you're looking at something like a table, say a table would be una mesa, whereas the car would be un carro. So both times meaning the same thing but translated using different words because it's a gendered language. La luna, the moon, la verdad, the truth, all using the female articles, and they will also use the female pronouns. So let me give you an example of this then. So for instance, if I if I said in Spanish, the car is huge, I saw it yesterday, that would be el carro es enorme, lo vi ayer. Now, the word order in Spanish is a bit different. Lo, it's I saw yesterday. Lo vi ayer. But if I was talking about a man, and I wanted to say the man is huge, I saw him yesterday, right? I saw him yesterday. It would be the man is huge, el hombre es enorme, lo vi ayer. So it's exactly the same pronoun as used for the car, but it's translated it for the car and it's translated him for the man, right? It's exactly the same principle in Greek. The Spanish pronoun is identical in both sentences. In sentences, lo, lo. Both el carro, the car, and el hombre, the man, are grammatically masculine nouns. Now, a man is a proper male object, whereas a car, you could go either way. In fact, there's other words in Spanish, like in some Latin American countries, they call a car la máquina, the machine, actually, but they use that for car. Now, la is then, a máquina is a feminine now, but so a car can be feminine or masculine depending on the word used for it. So it's the context. The grammatical gender of car, carro, does not transform an automobile into a male person, right? Context and the nature of the referent determine whether we translate the Spanish word lo, it, or he, right? Depending on what you're talking about. So this illustrates a crucial distinction that linguists make between, firstly, grammatical gender, which is a classification system for nouns that determines agreement with articles, adjectives, pronouns, just the same in Greek, and natural gender, so the actual biological or personal sex of something you're talking about. So I just wanted to put that forward for your consideration because the same principle applies to Greek. There's a book called Gender by linguist Greville Corbett. And he says in there, quote, "Grammatical gender is a system of noun classification. It need not correspond to any property of the real world referent," end quote. So a Spanish speaker, for instance, instinctively knows that lo, their word for either him or it means it when they're talking about a car, and they know that lo means him when they're talking about a man. Not because the pronoun changes, but because the nature of the thing that's being spoken about determines the translation. And that's the point I want to make. I know I've gone round a bit long-winded to get to this point, but it's the what you're actually talking about that determines whether you should use it or he. Now, if we're going back to John 1 and we're talking about logos, well, every single instance of logos used throughout the New Testament is referring to a teaching, a word, a message, a testimony, a command. That none of them are people or persons. It's this kind of message, teaching, reference. That's not a person. So then why change the rules for the prologue of John? It's the only place it's done. Think about that. It's the only place where it's personified in that sense with the pronouns. Nowhere else, ever. So, when we come to John 1 to 3, for instance, the question is not grammatical but interpretive. What did John intend logos to signify? To signify? If John meant God's creative word, wisdom, plan, message, even scripture, then it appropriately captures the real meaning. But if John meant a pre-existent personal being, then he would be appropriate. And the grammar alone can't settle this question. That's the thing. Daniel Wallace, in his book, Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, he says gender in Greek is primarily a grammatical category, not a natural one. So sound biblical interpretation requires that we not read theological conclusions into grammatical features that can't bear that weight. To argue that logos must be a personal he simply because the Greek pronouns are masculine, that commits a fallacy known as a category error. You're confusing grammatical categories with ontological realities, i.e., what grammar compared to the actual being of something. And I believe that a first century Jewish reader, steeped in the Hebrew scriptures, where God's dabar, for instance, word, was his powerful self-expression, and they wouldn't automatically assume that logos referred to a second divine person. And the identification of the logos with the man Jesus comes explicitly later in John 1:14. This is where the personal pronouns truly become personal, but we haven't moved on to that part yet, but we will get there, and I'll explain what that means in the next video. Well, not the next video, but in following videos. We're just going to kind of flesh this whole thing out. Excuse the pun. Anyway, thanks for listening. And give us a like if you liked it, and if you haven't also already done so, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.